Colonizing Palestine. This video is for my lil brother who wants to learn more about what's going on. I want to greet you in the beautiful greeting of your people. Yá'át'ééh no. I am grateful you are well. And I want to greet you with the greetings of Islam. Asalamu alaikum. May peace surround you. To understand what is happening in Palestine, you have to understand colonialism and occupation. As people who have historically experienced colonialism and occupation, the best place to start is by looking at our own histories. There are two major clues that occupation and colonialism are happening. The first sign is power. There is a group of people, the colonizers, that have some kind of power over another group of people, the colonized. This could be military power, economic power, political power, or another type of power through which they can control the colonized. The second sign is stealing. The colonizers have taken something from the colonized population. Very simply, when there are people that have power over another and use that power to steal what belongs to the people they have power over, then you have colonialism. When the people in power steal land from another people, we call that settler colonialism. That is what is happening now in Palestine. And that is what has happened in many other places of the world. But you might be wondering, how can one group of people just take things that belong to another people? No one would let that happen. You are right. Most people wouldn't allow oppression and stealing, unless they convince themselves and others that what they are doing is right, and they ignore and justify the impact of their actions on the colonized population. There are 5 main steps that colonizers around the world use to start and sustain colonization. Step number 1 is authority to annex. Authority to annex means that colonizing powers claim that science or God or some higher authority above humans justifies their action to annex land or resources from other people. Step number 2 is belittling and dehumanization. Colonizing powers show the colonized as being inferior in some way. They describe the colonized using words like savages, animals, uncivilized, or other terms that takes away their humanness. Step number 3 is cluelessness. Cluelessness is being ignorant of the effects of their actions. Colonizers don't see how their actions are taking away freedom, ending lives, crushing hopes, and destroying dreams. They don't listen to news, voices, and stories about the colonized. As a result, they don't realize that people they are oppressing will want to fight for their freedom and resist colonization and occupation. Step number 4 is denial. Colonizers don't realize how their behavior is negatively affecting people that are just like them. When the oppressed resist their oppression and try to obtain their freedom, colonizers can't believe that they are the oppressors. They are in denial that acts of resistance are a defensive acts against colonization. Step number 5 is entrenchment. When colonized peoples resist colonization, colonizers are often in denial that their actions and behaviors are being resisted. Instead, colonizers assume the colonized must be resisting because they are savages, wild animals, uncivilized, and less than humans. So they increase their dehumanization, violent oppression, and colonization. Doing acts of resistance entrenches colonizers. They increase dehumanization and increase colonization. Not doing acts of resistance also entrenches colonizers. They continue their dehumanization and expand their colonization. Dehumanization happens after resistance when colonizers interpret acts of resistance from the colonized as being driven from within the person or from an evil impulse or ideology unrelated to colonialism. On the other hand, they interpret their own violence as being just and driven by the behavior of the colonized. Let's summarize how colonialism starts and how it is sustained before looking at examples. Colonization and occupation starts with the colonizers finding a divine justification to colonize and portraying the colonized as less than human. Once colonization and occupation starts, there is an ignorance and cluelessness of the effects of oppression on the oppressed. And when there is resistance to oppression, there is shock and denial. There is denial that the colonizers had been oppressing. To explain the act of resistance without accepting their role in it, colonizers point to the subhuman nature of the colonized and increase their oppression and colonization. There is ongoing cluelessness of the effects of their oppression, and the cycle of violence continues leading to greater and greater colonization with every act of resistance. Colonizers follow this pattern of behavior over and over again, in the past and in our present. An example is the annexation of land from Native Americans and the colonization of Turtle Island to form United States and other countries. For the taking of land from indigenous communities on Turtle Island, the moral justification that was developed is known as the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery provided a justification for the colonization and takeover of territories not occupied by Christians through religious, political, and legal means. The doctrine of discovery is deeply rooted in a series of papal bulls, or official proclamations issued by the Pope, starting in the 1100s. Two specific papal bulls, official proclamations from the Pope, stand out in particular. The first is the Romanus Pontifex, issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1455, which granted the Portuguese exclusive rights to trade with Africa and legitimized the enslavement of indigenous peoples. The second is the Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, which supported the territorial claims made by Christian European explorers on newly discovered lands and waterways, pushing for Christian dominance and supremacy. According to the papal decree of 1493, if an explorer claimed to have discovered a piece of land in the name of a Christian European monarch, planted a flag on its soil, reported back his discovery to the European authorities, and returned to take possession of it, the land was considered rightfully his, even if there were already inhabitants present. The doctrine of discovery permitted occupation, colonialism, and taking of land from others because European settlers believed they were acting out a divine mandate and upheld a sense of cultural superiority. In the 19th century, the doctrine of discovery influenced the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny. The Monroe Doctrine asserted American dominance over the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. Manifest Destiny was the belief that American settlers were destined to expand across the continent, and that this expansion was both inevitable and a divine right. The influence of the doctrine of discovery also extended into the realm of U.S. law during the 1823 Supreme Court case Johnson v. McIntosh. In this case, the doctrine was integrated into federal law, and it played a significant role in stripping Native American populations of their lands. Chief Justice John Marshall delivered a unanimous ruling declaring that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands, thereby granting them unquestionable ownership, while only leaving Native Americans with limited rights to reside on the land. The doctrine of discovery, the Monroe Doctrine, and Manifest Destiny gave colonizers the impression that a higher authority justified their actions. This was combined with depicting the colonized indigenous in a way that belittled and dehumanized them. In his annual address to Congress in 1833, President Andrew Jackson denounced Indians, stating, "They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere before long disappear." Dr. Robert Vincent Remini was an American historian and a professor emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He wrote a book called Andrew Jackson, in which he notes, when Jackson prepared to strip the Creeks of their property, his logic was simple. Indians were savage and warlike because they possessed too much land to roam in and therefore pursued wandering habits of life. If the range of their activities were sharply restricted, their errant habits would gradually subside, until at last necessity would prompt them to industry and agriculture as the only certain and lasting means of support. And by being industrious like white men, Indians would eventually share the blessings of civilized life. Thus, for the Indians' own safety and welfare, it was necessary to seize their property and restrict their movement. As a consequence, from 1830 to 1840, the U.S. Army removed 60,000 Indians, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, and others, from the east in exchange for new territory west of the Mississippi. Thousands died along the way of what became known as the Trail of Tears, and as colonization pushed ever westward, the Indian-designated territory continued to shrink. When colonizers believe they have the approval of an authority that is above humans, and they believe in the target population being less than human, then they feel comfortable with colonizing, occupying, and oppressing. A publication cataloging an 1852 government report called The Indians of Southern California and Contemporary Responses reported. The opinion then current among Californians, most of whom were not in contact with the Southern California Indians of the following report, was that destiny had awarded California to the Americans to develop, that the Aborigines were no asset to the state, and that wherever they interfered with progress, they should be pushed aside. The result was one of the most disgraceful chapters in the entire history of the state. Armed bands took the field against the Indians on an almost completely indiscriminate basis. A whole series of Indian wars ensued. They featured wholesale butchery and seemed to aim at complete liquidation of the Indians. The following quote from an author records popular attitudes during those days. "We will let those rascally redskins know that they have no longer to deal with the Spaniard or the Mexican, but with the invincible race of American backwoodsmen, which has driven the savage from Plymouth Rock to the Rocky Mountains, and has headed him off here on the western shore of the continent, and will drive him back to meet his kindred fleeing westward, all to be drowned in the Great Salt Lake." Colonizers are in denial that acts of resistance against violent colonization is actually related to violent colonization. Instead, colonizers feel that acts of resistance against violent colonization is actually related to the violent nature or ideologies or savagery of the oppressed. By imagining that acts of resistance to oppression are actually evidence of savagery, it allows colonizers to further support dehumanization and increase colonization. Dehumanization after resistance serves to increase colonization and occupation. In American history, we saw dehumanization after resistance happen again and again. We saw it after King Philip's War, the Seminole Wars, the Red Stick War, the Dakota War of 1862, the Modoc War, the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Yavapai Wars, the Apache Wars, the Pueblo Revolts, and more. After each act of resistance, colonizers were in denial that acts of resistance were related to ongoing occupation, colonization, genocide, and oppression. After each act of resistance, they could only imagine that resistance happened because the colonized were savages. By thinking of the colonized as less than humans, it was easy to respond to acts of resistance with brutality and more oppression. In 1782, 96 Delaware Indians were blamed for attacks on white settlements. Captain David Williamson ordered the Delawares to go to the cooper shop 2 at a time, where militiamen beat them to death with wooden mallets and hatchets. This came to be known as the Gnadenhutten Massacre. Another example of dehumanization and increased oppression after resistance happened in the South during the War of 1812. In the South, the War of 1812 bled into the Muskogee Creek War of 1813-1814, also known as the Red Stick War. The Red Stick War started as an intertribal conflict among Creek Indian factions, but then expanded into the politics involving colonizing powers. The British and Spanish backed the Indians to help keep Americans from encroaching on their interests. Early Creek victories inspired General Andrew Jackson to retaliate with 2,500 men, mostly Tennessee militia, in early November 1814. After the War of 1812, some Muskogee leaders such as William McIntosh and Chief Shalakta signed treaties that ceded more land to Georgia. The 1814 signing of the Treaty of Fort Jackson signaled the end for the Creek Nation and for all Indians in the South. Jackson opened this first peace session by faintly acknowledging the help of the friendly Creeks. That done, he turned to the Red Sticks and admonished them for listening to evil counsel. He demanded the equivalent of all expenses incurred by the United States in prosecuting the war, which, by his calculation, came to 23 million acres of land. This is the size of about a quarter of the state of California or a bit more than half the state of Florida. In a denial of the impact of genocide and colonization that the U.S. government was doing, Jackson cited an unprovoked war waged by the Creeks as one of the reasons for the very harsh terms in the treaty. When friendly Creek leaders like Shalakta and Big Warrior reminded Andrew Jackson that they have been keeping the peace, Jackson retorted to them that they did not cut Tecumseh's throat when they had the chance, so they must now cede Creek lands. Jackson also ignored Article 9 of the Treaty of Ghent that restored sovereignty to Indians and their nations. Indigenous people fighting back to defend their people and protect their homelands provided ample justification for colonizing forces to dehumanize and kill any indigenous person on the frontier, even peaceful ones. For example, when expanding white settlements in Colorado created tensions with the Cheyennes, who were under Chief Black Kettle, a well-known peace chief, Major John Chivington said, "The Cheyennes will have to be roundly whipped, or completely wiped out, before they will be quiet. I say that if any of them are caught in your vicinity, the only thing to do is kill them." A month later, while addressing a gathering of church deacons, Chivington dismissed the possibility of making a treaty with the Cheyenne. "It simply is not possible for Indians to obey or even understand any treaty. I am fully satisfied, gentlemen, that to kill them is the only way we will ever have peace and quiet in Colorado." Once a missionary to Wyandot Indians in Kansas, Chivington declared, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians, and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heavens to kill Indians." On November 29, 1864, Chivington led a surprise attack on a band of peaceful Cheyennes and Arapahoes on their reservation at Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. Federal Army officers had promised Cheyenne Black Kettle safety if he would return to the reservation. Chief Black Kettle had returned to the reservation and tied an American flag to his lodgepole as he was instructed, to indicate his village was at peace. He had also tied a white flag of truce. Chivington ordered an attack on the unsuspecting village. After hours of fighting, the Colorado Volunteers had lost only 9 men in the process of murdering between 200 and 400 Cheyenne, most of them women and children. After the slaughter, they scalped and mutilated many of the bodies, later exhibiting their trophies to cheering crowds in Denver. This came to be known as the Sand Creek Massacre. Indigenous people resisting peacefully and uniting together also provided ample justification for colonizing forces to kill indigenous people. In the late 1880s, the ghost dance spiritual movement emerged, spreading to 24 tribes across 16 states. The ghost dance movement threatened efforts to culturally assimilate tribal peoples by asking indigenous communities to return to traditional ways. In December 1890, several weeks after the Sioux chief Sitting Bull was killed while being arrested, the U.S. Army's 7th Cavalry massacred 150 to 200 ghost dancers at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. For their mass murder of disarmed Lakota on Wounded Knee, President Benjamin Harrison awarded about 20 soldiers the Medal of Honor. Even when acts of resistance were non-violent, the ignorance of the colonizers to the consequences of their own actions meant that there were always folks amongst the colonizers who continued to be shocked that anyone would be protesting. The inability to understand resistance and the misrepresentation of resistance continued even during the late 60s, when the press and media should have gotten used to providing coverage of civil rights issues. An example of misrepresenting resistance was the occupation of Alcatraz. One day in late November in 1969, Americans turned on their TV news to hear that a group of Native Americans that called itself Indians of all tribes had taken over and occupied Alcatraz Island. The takeover of Alcatraz Island was a very serious act of resistance, but much of the press dismissed it early on as a delightful stunt, or described the occupiers as a threat to white society and referred to them as angry Indians and red men. What the press should have asked is, what happened yesterday that this is happening today? They should have asked, what are things that have happened that led to this response? By truly understanding the colonized, the press would have learned that leading up to the occupation of Alcatraz, the U.S. government had seized millions of acres of native land, terminated services, and terminated the status of over 100 tribes. When looking at the act of resistance that the trail of broken treaties represented, the colonizing government was oblivious to the consequence of its actions in breaking treaties. A few years before the occupation of Alcatraz and before the caravan to Washington known as the Trail of Broken Treaties, a major treaty was violated. The construction of the Kinzua Dam was started on Seneca land. Construction of the Kinzua Dam meant that nearly 1/3 of the territory granted to the Seneca Nation under the Treaty of Canandaigua was taken over for the dam, and it resulted in the forced relocation of at least 600 Seneca from their community within the reservation. By building the Kinzua Dam, the government broke the Treaty of Canandaigua, yet it was the resistance to broken treaties that some media presented as social violations. By understanding how occupation and colonization works, we are able to understand the cycles of dehumanization, colonization, and violence. This is what is happening in Gaza now. To understand more about what is happening around the world, learn about your own history really well. By understanding yourself, you will have understood others. Your past is another's present. Thank you for watching.